So, accompaniment. What are you discussing as you walk along? Jesus walked alongside every person that he met. And he invited them to an encounter of God's love and mercy. And he called it, really, holy friendship. When you think about those disciples and apostles that he traveled around with, what were they first before anything else? They were his friends. I call you friend. No longer slave. I call you friend. And so when we speak about accompaniment, that's really what we're talking about. So during this session, we will explore what Pope Francis says about the vision of the new evangelization, which is through the process of that spiritual companioning, that art of accompaniment, that companioning of people along their journey to heaven. And so we begin with our mission. And not just the mission that we have now plastered on the front of our bulletin, which is beautiful and wonderful and specific to St. Vincent's, but the universal vision and mission of the church. Any guess what it is? The church exists to evangelize. It is the grace and vocation proper to each and every one of us. That's a long word, and Catholics are getting an opportunity in the last 20 years to wrap their arms around it. But what is evangelization then? Simply put, it is bringing the good news of Jesus Christ, his love, his salvation, his mercy, the holiness he calls us to, into every life situation that we have. Our workplaces, our homes, our families, our friends, the people in the grocery store, the people in the church parking lot that cut us off. It happens. I think I've done it once. If it was you, I'm sorry. Bringing the good news of salvation, the good news of God's love and mercy into every one of our life situations. As Father Tom said earlier, that whole of Christian life, that first rule of Christian life is charity, is love. And so it undergirds, it's that foundation of accompaniment. In fact, accompaniment is the way in which we live it out in our community. We come alongside one another. We come, we take it, and we go out, and we come alongside people out there. Not just here, but most of our Christian life as the laity is spent in the world. Few of us actually work inside the church on a day-to-day basis, 40 hours a week, with long titles and short salaries. It's not that bad. We spend Christian life out there. We accompany out there. We need to love out there. And we encounter people out there. So what is accompaniment anyway? I keep throwing the word around. If you hear that word, what do you think of accompaniment? Walk with. What other ways? What does John do every Sunday for us beautifully? He accompanies us. He's the accompanist extraordinaire here at St. Vincent's. So sometimes our first thoughts might go to that. But certainly, what Francis is calling us to, what Jesus is calling us to, is accompaniment out there. But there's something to be learned from that accompaniment that we hear every Sunday. that relationship between the music and the vocalist. And so I'm going to invite you to just kind of sit back, close your eyes if you trust me, and listen. As you listen to the music I'm about to share, I'd like you to listen closely to what is happening between the dance of the vocalist and the music. So what did you hear happening between the vocalist and the music? Pardon me?
Conversation.
A conversation. Harmony.
Making space for the other while at the same time maintaining their own, what they bring.
Making space for the other while owning what they bring.
Complement each other.
They complement each other.
Sharon, also a beautiful blending of the two.
Thank you. Definitely a beautiful blending of the two. What was that? Support. Yes, that's another really key word.
I'm going to say trusting each other, knowing that they're on the same, they're coordinated there.
Exactly. Trusting each other. There's a strong relationship there. One does not overshadow the other.
I like to say what they are doing, but also what they're not doing.
Okay.
And what they're not doing is drowning each other out.
Not drowning each other out.
We use that expression sometimes.
Have you ever felt drowned out? So, not drowning them out. A relationship that is supportive, in harmony, lifting up the other, not overpowering one or the other. Can we go ahead and switch to the next slide? So what exactly do accompanists do? I actually asked Dan Hennessy to mention something about this too. His daughter is a vocalist, and she has a great way of describing this.
Yeah, I think most of you know my daughter's in college studying vocal performance. And one of the first things that occurred when she arrived on campus, she was assigned to an accompanist. And with her being 7 hours away, we talked a lot in the car going back and forth. And along the way, in one of the conversations, she talked about the best accompanist that she had ever had. And I said, okay, what does that mean? You know, I always assumed the accompanist, the person playing the piano, was the leader, and the vocalist was following. But it's actually the other way around. A good accompanist follows the singer. The singer sets the pace, the vocalist sets the pace. When the vocalist wants to slow down and slows down more than what you might think the music should do, that accompanist has to slow down, has to be in tune to what the vocalist is doing and slow down. If the nerves of the vocalist, they got them going faster, they got to pick up the pace too. So, and if the vocalist is getting quieter, for whatever reason, you've got to back down the volume. So it's being acutely aware of what the vocalist is doing and following that, letting them take the lead. And I thought it was absolutely 180 degrees the other way around. So it was interesting and different.
So the vocalist is taking the lead. But what did you hear? You heard the synergy of it. So the accompanist is allowing the vocalist to take the lead. What does that tell us about Christian accompaniment? When we come up alongside someone else and they have questions along the way, we're letting them take the lead. We don't impose ourselves, we lift them up. So, an accompanist is someone in the background of the performance, allowing the singer to shine. The accompanist embellishes speeds up, walks slower, keeps pace. But the singer can't do it without the accompanist. This brings us to Pope Francis again. In the Joy of the Gospel, where we hear the call from Pope Francis of the Church to embrace this art of accompaniment, he tells us, he teaches us, the Church will have to initiate everyone, priests, religious, and the laity, us, into the art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. It sounds beautiful. When put into a piece of music, it's just awe-inspiring. But when put into relationship, it is holy. So Pope Francis's art of accompaniment is a steady reassurance of reflecting our closeness, of having a compassionate gaze, a loving gaze. As Father Tom said downstairs, and the catechist in me went aflutter, catechesis, which is another form of accompaniment, is an echo. We, as we walk along with other people, we hear catechesis sometimes and we think teacher, teacher, teacher. Think accompaniment, accompaniment, accompaniment. We echo our falling in love with God, and we see that God in the other person across from us or beside us. And if we're doing our work as accompaniment as well, they're seeing the face of God in us as well. Of course, Pope Francis is helping us understand accompaniment and evangelization in the 21st century. But someone far more popular than he modeled this in the 1st century. And I'd like to invite Jill up to share the next story for you.
We're going to be reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. Now that very day, 2 of them were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people, and how our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel." And besides all of this, it's now the third day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them at the table, he took bread, said the blessing, and broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
It's a familiar story. We hear it every Easter. To accompany is literally to break bread. At your tables, I'd like you to unpack this scripture a little bit. So that second handout from your packet that Jill just actually proclaimed from, on the flip side, there's an exercise. With 2 or 3 people at your table, or, if you're like crowd sourcing kind of things, and you want to do that together, that's okay too. You can do the whole table together. Examine the scripture and look for what it tells us about Christ's model of accompaniment. And then there are 4 questions that are both up on the screen and on the paper there too. If you can select someone from your table to kind of record your thoughts, I think we'll begin to be able to flesh out what accompaniment can look like at St. Vincent's. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. What are you discussing as you walk along? So what have you been discussing as you walk along with the scripture, side by side with one another? How did you answer some of those questions? Can you describe what he did?
Jesus sort of, we took it from the scripture, he sort of played it down.
So plays down. No, that's okay. He knew who they were, and they didn't know who he was. So.
Right, so he just, by kind of playing sort of candidly dumb,
he wanted to hear, like, what are you talking about? What are these people saying about me? So he could get a feel for what's going on in the people, and maybe knew how to redirect. And just, like Karen said it beautifully, he came back to make sure we knew how to carry on his word. Because at that time, the people were pretty much, I don't want to say persecuted, but they wanted to talk about God or Jesus. Because that was like a taboo thing, because they had multi-gods at one point. So Jesus gave his life, and he wanted to come back and see, well, did they get the lesson for them to carry on my teachings?
Thank you, thank you. So he comes alongside them, and they didn't know who he was, but he knew who they were. And he asked the question, what are you talking about? Like, what's been going on? As if he didn't know. Okay, what else happened? Christina, I'm going to do a little Oprah thing here, I guess.
Please hold the microphone close.
Yes, ma'am. We were struck with how patient the Lord was. Where he could have, he could have said, really? Still? Here? But that he was very patient, and he brought them along gently and kindly in love.
It's been 3 years and you still don't get it? Right, here they are. They're pretty much racing from Jerusalem towards Emmaus. They're running, they're fleeing. And he comes alongside them and is patient. What else? Yes.
So we really discussed how the apostles, how Jesus met them where they were physically, spiritually, and mentally, and he walked with them patiently, like that group was saying too.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next question. I know you all answered this, but in the interest of our time, I want to make sure that we get through all the questions. What did he say? What did he say? What was his attitude and disposition?
We thought he was kind of mixed at the beginning. It was sort of like his, well, you're foolish. What do you mean? Don't you know? We've been talking about this, like you said, for 3 years, and you don't understand what's going on around here. And then he changed and very calmly led them into searching for the truth, and actually sort of led them on their own to search for the truth, is what I was saying before.
What was the methodology? If you were to describe it as a methodology of accompaniment, what would be the term that you would use to describe that? He started questioning. I saw that, Joan. He started questioning. He didn't impose something. He didn't say, this is the way it is. He came up alongside them and gently asked them questions. Open-ended questions. You should be writing this down. But that is a key point to accompaniment. Coming alongside, getting to know who the person is, listening. Not just hearing and racing to be able to respond with the right answer or what you think they should be thinking or saying, but listening to what they're really saying, listening to what they're feeling, what the emotional state is, what's going on with them along the way. Rory? Your hand is raised.
I don't really need a microphone, I don't think. No, whenever I read Emmaus, I love reading the Road to Emmaus, and kind of simply for me, it's the model of the Mass in a lot of ways. You're welcomed into a relationship, you have scripture, and then you break bread. So for me, and that's what is accompaniment other than that too. We lead others to Christ. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So they get to a certain point. Oh, I'm sorry, Dan.
Maybe you were heading in this direction too, but in the end, he basically made them invite him to stay, to spend more time with them. He was ready to walk on if they didn't want him any longer in their life.
He was ready to walk away. Continue on. He made as if he was continuing on the journey. And they invited him to stay.
But following on that, he really didn't, almost like come clean, he didn't straight credible until they came back to him and invited him to stay, because he was all prepared to leave him. So they showed some charity to him by inviting him to stay with them for the night.
They invited him. Think of the journey together with someone. They invite us to stay. Tell us more. Yes?
He respected their freedom.
Yes, free will. He respected their freedom to continue running away, even though he had broken open the scriptures to them. And then what does he do? That true, literal meaning of accompaniment? He breaks bread with them. And they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Were our hearts not burning within us when he was talking to us? How did we not see? And this is key, though. This is the key point now. What did they do next? They went back to Jerusalem. They jumped up, and they were running one way, and they turned around and ran the other. And then they told them what they saw, what they heard, how they encountered the Lord on the road to Emmaus, how he revealed himself in the breaking of the bread. That there is hope, that there is mercy, that there is love, that there's a different ending than what I thought. So, when we're talking about accompaniment, we need to become consciously aware of how God is found in the story of each person. There are a lot of things that we hear today. They're on the internet, they're talking heads, there are all kinds of things that are telling us what we should think, what we should feel, how we should behave, even in the church. And we have to be true to that doctrine, that tradition. But as Father Tom said earlier, it is rooted in relationship. It is rooted in encounter. It is rooted in love. It's intimate, it's intentional, and it dynamically can change the world. And it certainly changes lives. Think of yourselves along the way and how the encounter with God through another person has changed your life. I don't think that we're all here by accident. There might be a little bit of Catholic guilt about it. But someone changed your life on that too. But who accompanied you? When you wanted to run to Emmaus from the church, from sex abuse scandals, from a bad encounter with a staff member, when you wanted to run away, when you had a loss or sorrow, or even joys, but those moments of deep darkness, when you wanted to run away, who accompanied you? How did you encounter Christ that you turned around? And maybe you're at different points in that journey right now, but we're all called back to Jerusalem. And we're called to accompany others there as well. Terry, I'm off script. You have to just go.
Remember, when you're lost, God is present, like Tom said.
Yes. God is never absent in any situation, even when we don't feel his presence. Okay. So how do we sum this up? I'd like to say that I came up with this phrase, but I didn't. It came from a book called Becoming Friends by Paul Waddell. And it is a truly virtuous and holy friendship is one that wills the good for the other above all else, and encourages the practice of virtue and ultimately friendship with God. So all of our accompaniment is oriented towards God. Even the encounter in the parking lot when someone cut you off. Jesus modeled for us a constellation of virtues: charity, humility, courage, patience, and your lists go on and on and on about that. This spiritual accompaniment is us gently guiding each other along the pathway to God. Sometimes that will happen in a single encounter. I just had one of the strangest of places, and if you want to ask me about it afterwards, I'll tell you. But it was the strangest set of circumstances, and it was chance, but it was amazing. It could be a single encounter where paths come together, and then they part. And then there are journeys that are longer. Co-workers, parishioners, friends, family. You're kind of stuck with them. At least that's what they tell me. But all along, it is about that holy friendship. It's not perfect. It's not without its challenges, and we all bring our stuff and our sinfulness and all those things to those relationships. Which brings us back to those three things that Father Tom talked about, that prayer, that fasting, and that almsgiving of Lent. What Lent does for us is brings us back to what it's really about. And as the Beatles would say, it's all about love. But so in this, we're catching up on St. Vincent's time, but we're still perfect in God's time. I do want to draw your attention to two other things. One is this book, The Art of Accompaniment. Page 19, please. At the top of the page, you'll see that it begins to ask some questions. Because when we're going to accompany others, we need to kind of be in touch with our story of God in our life. And it spans, from our baptism, from our birth, throughout our life. But to look for those moments, and it poses some questions for us individually, but there are also questions that we can pose as we accompany others. How long have I experienced God's grace or God's call at moments of loss, accomplishment, sinfulness, reconciliation, anger, joy, hope? What have I learned about myself? How would we flip that question around? What have you learned from that experience? What good habits or virtues have I acquired in those experiences? The sun is coming. What weaknesses have I struggled to overcome? How have I not allowed God in? God's grace to be there, God's love to be there. How have I rejected God's love? And we can do that. We have those, I have them, little tapes in front of your head that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not, all these things. But that's all a lie. How do we engage in that? Allow the scriptures, that holy tradition, that foundation to speak to us. That story, to connect with our story, to connect with the story of our companions. How do we allow that bread of life and that cup of salvation, which I guess we have to abstain from right now, at that Eucharistic table to feed us? That Eucharistic table, that sacrifice, which is, another word for love. The church's word for that, is this love feast, agape. It's unconditional love that we encounter there that spans that whole of Christian life. These are just some of the questions that we can ask. And it's the start of the conversation. And it's a conversation that, as a parish, we want to continue. And there will be a sign-up sheet. There is a sign-up sheet over there on the table, because we're going to be beginning faith-sharing discipleship groups. And our first task is to spend some time going through this book. There are no predetermined times, no predetermined, locations yet. But right now it's just simply an invitation to come alongside one another, to be equipped to walk alongside others and ask the questions of love.